Thank you for joining me, folks, and today we're going to be talking about equity theory. Equity theory, according to your book, is the theory of motivation that concentrates on people's perceptions of the fairness of their work outcomes relative to or in proportion to their work inputs. BusinessDictionary.com defines this theory as a concept that people derive job satisfaction and motivation by comparing their efforts, or their inputs, and their income, their outputs, with those of other people in the same or other firms. Two definitions both seem to agree that motivation is driven by people's perceptions when comparing themselves to others. First off, I want to say that inputs and outputs are relative, which means that they are perceived. There could be many different inputs and outputs. Some examples of inputs would be effort, loyalty, hard work, commitment, and skill. Some examples of outputs would be financial rewards, recognition, reputation, and responsibility. This is a very generic graph. Things can be proportionally the same if the inputs rise with the outcomes. So in order for people to remain motivated at work, there has to be a perceived balance between what inputs they contribute and what outputs they receive. Let's look at some definitions. A referent is another person or a group of people perceived to be similar to oneself in a previous job, or one's expectations about what outcome-input ratio should be. Equity, according to your book, exists when a person perceives his or her own outcome-input ratio to be equal to a referent's outcome-input ratio. BusinessDictionary.com defines equity as fairness and impartiality toward all concerned, based on the principles of even-handed dealing. So therefore, equity is a perceived idea of how fair a certain job is. Basically, when comparing to other people, one perceives things to be fair when one's outcomes match the perceived effort that you or a referent put into it to get said outcomes. As long as things are perceived to be fair, employees will continue working at current levels of inputs to their organizations to receive their current outcomes. Fairness continues to be perceived as good even as other employees in the same job description are being paid more, provided that the amount of inputs increase with it. Inequity. Inequity exists when a person's outcome-input ratio is not perceived to be equal when compared to a referent. Simply put, inequity is a lack of fairness. There are two types: underpayment inequity and overpayment inequity. Underpayment inequity exists when a person's own outcome-input ratio is perceived to be less than that of a referent. In comparison, you think you're not receiving the outcomes you should be considering what you put in. For example, you are getting paid $9 an hour. Your coworker, who is doing the same job as you, is getting paid $13 an hour. You, therefore, in comparison to your referent, are experiencing underpayment inequity. This, by the way, also is a reason why you could have a norm at work about not telling others what you make. It's not their business and can lead to a perception of inequity. Overpayment inequity exists when a person perceives that his or her own outcome-input ratio is greater than that of a referent. In comparison, you think you're receiving more outcomes than you should be. What happens if we let inequity continue? Inequity can be a major cause of stress for an employee. They may decide to correct the problem on their own. Those experiencing underpayment inequity may decrease their working hours, stop coming in early or staying later, decrease their quality of work, and even seek other employment opportunities elsewhere. Those experiencing overpayment inequity may try to restore equity by changing their perceptions of their own or a referent's inputs or outcomes. When employees fail at restoring the balance, they can change their perceptions of their own or the referent's inputs or outcomes. Maybe they're working on harder projects after all. One way equity can be restored is by changing perceptions. The employee could realize that he or she is really contributing more inputs than he or she thought originally. The employee could also realize that the referent is putting in less inputs or getting more outcomes than he originally thought. So basically, the situation is different than what you perceive it to be. Motivation is highest when as many people as possible in an organization perceive that they are being equitably treated. Their inputs and their outcomes are in balance. Top contributors continue with their high level of work, and mediocre performers are motivated to contribute more. How can we restore the balance? According to Boundless.com, we can restore the balance in two ways. 1. Having a fair reward system, and 2. Establishing rules in these systems that also discourage inequitable treatment. Thank you very much for watching my lecture. I hope it was informative for you.